All right, so it looks like we have who is going to be here at least on time. So we'll go ahead and get started. I know Missy and Cecilia and Melissa, I know all of y'all pretty well. So it's good to see y'all are here to get a little knowledge on surveys. It's really exciting stuff. Everyone always asks me about surveys and things like that. So I'm really glad to be able to share some information with you. So I'm going to go ahead and just want to make sure, can everybody see my screen? Probably not yet because I haven't shared it, but it's going to happen soon. Now, everybody should be able to see my screen. So I'm going to go ahead and make that full screen right quick. Go. All right. So this is my presentation on surveys and encroachments, things of that nature. And really, I like to kind of approach things from what y'all will see as agents and what you need to do in your perspective when you get that dreaded email from the title attorney or from the attorney's office that, oh my gosh, we've got an issue, that we've reviewed a survey, we need a survey, something like that, and how you can address it, how you can communicate that to your clients without giving legal advice, but also seeming knowledge, because that's the sort of thing that really gives you a leg up. So what I will do, and the way I always like to start these, is to give a list of definitions for basically what we're going to be going through. That way you'll have something to refer back to. If you have any questions, we can kind of go over, this kind of goes over the nuts and bolts of what some of these terms are going to hear on. So your survey, I'm sure y'all are familiar with that, but that's a detailed map of the property and identifies every aspect of what can be seen on that property, including property that you may own or property that you may not own. And that's just in terms of neighbors, sometimes neighbors' lots and what can be encroaching onto your property, things like that. We'll talk about that here in a bit. The PLS, that's what you call the professional land surveyor. They are licensed. They are the professional that your client should allow to draw your surveys. We've had clients who have tried to have us review surveys that they've tried to draw, and they've taken the metal detector, gone out there, we had someone actually do this. Took their metal detector, went out there, drew it by hand, and then asked us to review that survey for them. We're not going to review a survey that's not done by a professional. So please tell your client to, hire somebody. They're going to do a better job than you are. No offense. Now your encroachment, that is your property, real property or personal property that can belong to one owner that sits on the property of another owner. And so anytime something's over the line, even whether it be an inch, whether it be 10 feet, that's going to be considered an encroachment. Now, what is an easement? You hear that term all the time. That's permission that one owner gives to another owner of a piece of property to allow that person to utilize the land that they don't own and that the grantee does, or the grantor does, for some purpose. And sometimes it's for a purpose you can see, sometimes for a purpose you can't see. Now setback, you're going to hear that term a lot too. Those are lines that basically are drawn by a governing body, be it an HOA, be it a county or a municipality, be it the person drawing the approving the plat. This just permits where a structure and a dwelling really can be built or cannot be built. And it's basically done to keep distances between structures and neighboring properties, but also structures in the roads as well, because you don't want a house to be right up on the road. That's a bit of a safety hazard. Now, the real estate attorney, that's ideally me. That's the person that your client will pay to know and handle all this stuff for you, so you don't have to memorize and know all this stuff, because I will for you. And your meets and bounds, you're going to hear that a little bit. That's your old-timey way of describing the lot lines to the property. Old-timey is a very technical term, and basically it's the whole go 30.7 feet, 20 degrees, 30 minutes, 20 seconds to the rock on the corner of the Jones line. And then that's how they used to measure these lot lines. There are some lot lines, especially for either family land or property that's out in the county, that is not mapped. And so when the something is not mapped, then you have to use a meets and bounds description in order for the county to identify what land is actually being transferred. And then you've got your plat map. Plat map is just what's on file with the Register of Deeds, and that is going to enable you to more efficiently describe your property. So those are those subdivisions that are nice and neat and have numbers 1 through 10 on there, and it's just very accurately described. It's got all your measurements on there. It makes everyone's life a lot easier if you can refer to a plat map in order to transfer property. So anyway, any questions about any of those definitions? And just so you know, if you have any questions, obviously there aren't tons of us here. Please, I want this to be as interactive as you want it to be. So if you have any questions, please stop, let me know, unmute. I am happy to answer whatever you got. So right away is basically an easement. It depends. Well, it can be an easement. So if it's a public right of way, then it wouldn't be an easement because it wouldn't own to anybody. A public right of way would just be property that the government owns and that's maintained, that's used for public access. But you've also got your private right of ways, such as your driveways and your private roads, things of that nature. That these are roads that are owned by people, and then their easements granted, which are private access easements, and so people can utilize those to get to the properties. Any other questions about any of these definitions? All right. So we always get this question, should I order a survey? And so our stock answer is yes, always get a survey, except there are a couple times there you don't necessarily want to get a survey or don't necessarily need a survey. If your client is buying raw land, you should almost always advise they get a survey. We had some clients, client acting on her own behalf, did not hire a realtor. She went out in Rowan County. She bought about 6 acres of land. And after buying the land, had a survey done after closing and found that there was an easement on that land. She was not able to identify the location. Turns out that easement was in the only location that the property perked. So she was not able to put the septic system she wanted there, and ultimately just bought a huge tract of land that was completely not useless to them. They were going to buy their dream house. Unfortunately, by not getting a survey done beforehand, it cost them the ability to build the house they wanted to, believe they're building a smaller house and may try to sell it. But it's very important when you're buying raw land to get, or vacant land, to get a survey. You're buying large tracts, especially tracts where farming is done. That's going to be an expensive survey, but a lot of these large tracts where farming is done tend to have been owned by these folks for decades. So it's very difficult and a lot of times you're going to see that there have been other people who are farming on that land, using it for their purposes. It really can become, just because there's such a vast amount of land out there, that a lot of times people can't keep their eyes on everything. So they're almost always encroachments. Whenever we see those 50, 60, 70 acre surveys, we almost always see at least 1 to 2 encroachments on there by neighboring farms, not because there's any intent, but just because they don't really know. I mean, it's hard to manage something that size and keep someone else's crops or whatever off your property, especially if you have a lot of these old farmers really haven't done a survey in several decades. So they might not know the lot lines at that point themselves either. A lot of them have fences. Sometimes the fences of other lots go through there. So I always advise getting the survey there too. If you've got a client, especially an investor client who's looking to build on a property, I would definitely advise when or if you're either buying from someone or if you're getting someone that's doing that who's going to build, I would advise them, when they're doing a spec build, I would definitely advise them to get a survey. A lot of investors don't necessarily do the legwork that they need to do when they purchase the property. So they won't get a survey, they'll build on it, and they might get the approvals they need, but a lot of folks just will buy it, not knowing. They'll go in and rehab it. All they care about is going in, flipping it, getting it done, and getting back out. The likelihood that they've done a survey is probably pretty low, unless they've added to that property. So, and a lot of investors will have bought that property from someone who's either, if it's been distressed for a while, then you're going to see that there's some issues out there on those properties that have not been addressed. And a lot of times the investors are like, you know what, give it to me, I'm going to buy it, I'm going to flip it, I don't care, and I'll sell it and let whoever buys it deal with the problem. So if you know that you're buying from an investor, someone who's recently flipped the property, it's definitely a consideration to get a survey. And then if you can tell that they're close by buildings, structures, things like that on the property, it's always a really good idea to get a survey, just to be able to identify and clarify whether those close by ancillary buildings, things like that, are on the property that they're intending. They're not on they're not somewhere down the road, and they're not basically on your property. Because if it's very clear that say the neighbor has a shed that's very clearly like, oh yeah, that's pretty close, you should get a survey just to evaluate that, because the GIS isn't going to tell you everything. And sometimes the GIS will show that there's an encroachment and it'll be wrong. I always suggest, if you think that there's an encroachment, get a survey just to verify. Now I've got your maybe but probably so table, just because, again, that's kind of our stock answer. When I say standard purchases, I mean just your retail. I'm buying, I'm selling to you. It's just a house in a neighborhood with an HOA. There's, generally speaking, if you're in that sort of situation, yeah, the HOA has probably managed it pretty well, probably confirmed that there haven't been any encroachments. But some HOAs are different than others. Some will have your architectural committees that'll make you bring in your surveys and get all those guidelines done. Other HOAs are a little bit more relaxed on how they handle this. So I always advise, unless you think you can get a survey from the seller, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and get a survey, especially now that surveyors aren't delaying it quite as long as they were months ago. Now, family transfers, this is basically anytime that you're buying something where it's either a family member selling to another family member, or you're buying from a family who has passed it on in the family for years and years, I would say that's a good idea too. Just because if it's been in the family for decades and decades, kind of operates like the farming in large tracts, when a lot of folks just haven't done the actual legwork. A lot of quick claim deeds usually are in there, so nobody's done a survey for a while to identify what it is that they actually have and what's around the lot. Now, if you have buyers and you know they plan on a fence, you might as well kill two birds with one stone. Go ahead and get the survey beforehand. That way they can have it ready to go, provide it to whoever their fence builder is as soon as they get it closed. So that way it's already done. And plus you've gotten the benefit of having the survey exception removed from your title insurance policy. And if you're buying an in unit on a townhome, it's usually a good idea to do it. I mean, again, it's probably more in between the maybe and not really on the in unit of a townhome, but ultimately there are some items that some other people could have put near the in unit of townhome. A lot of times the HOA will put something on the property that may or may not be okay to be there. So, and that happens more than you think with in units on townhomes. So it's not a bad idea to do it. I mean, ultimately, again, it's not incredibly expensive when you look at the whole. Then not really. Condos, I mean, if you were to draw a survey of a condo, it would be a box floating in the sky for the most part. There's no reason for that. There's really no reason to get a condo survey. And then middle units on townhomes, same thing. I mean, you do have a front and a back, essentially. But generally speaking, most developers are going to give you substantial room because you're going to walk in the front door. Usually there's a parking access or something like that. Back door in the backyard or in the back of the townhome. So you should have, if you have a middle unit, it's very, very unlikely you're actually going to see any sort of any sort of encroachment. Any questions about kind of the should I not? All right. So moving on to the next section. So you've been advised that, yeah, you need to get a survey. What do you do now? You'll call your trusted surveyor ASAP. I suggest most of you have a list of 3 to 5 that you develop a relationship with. Most folks have the one that they know that they can call and be like, hey, how soon can I get on the calendar? And they'll actually answer the phone for you. The more that you work with a surveyor, and I'm sure you all know this, the better opportunity you have, the better chance you have at having to pick up the phone. And that's a lot of vendors, that's half the battle. If they get a call from somebody that they don't know, a lot of them aren't picking them up, and because until they get comfortable with you, they know that you're a reliable source of business for them. Surveyors are still backed up, so it'll be a few weeks, generally speaking, before you get on. I've heard some surveyors are about 4 to 6 weeks out. I've heard there are other surveyors about 8 to 12 weeks out. And that's a lot better than surveyors who are 6 to 9 months out. When we were in the middle of last year and the end of last year and the beginning of this year. So we're in much better shape when it comes to those. So if your client definitely wants to wait on the results of a survey in order to close, make sure you adjust the closing date to adjust the closing date accordingly. So in your offers, if you know you want a survey, go ahead and talk to the surveyor before you even submit the offer. And because your client say, hey, my client really wants a survey. We're looking at closing on X date. Can you get it done by then? And then that's when, if they say no, then you kind of got to run through your list and see, call until you find someone who can say yes, especially if your client really wants it. And make sure that you can tell your client this, because this isn't legal advice. This is practical advice. If they have a survey and the attorney reviews it and the title insurance company reviews it, that's going to eliminate any sort of survey exception to your title insurance, which can be beneficial for them, because then the title insurance company knows what's on that survey. So if there are any issues that the surveyor made a mistake about, there might be some title insurance coverage on that. Any questions about these steps? All right, so you wait the time, the surveyor finishes the survey, we get the survey back. What happens now? The surveyor should send that survey to our office, or if you receive a copy, you don't know whether the surveyor sent it, you can send it also. Because we would like to review the survey. We always want to, if your client's had a survey done, it certainly makes sense for the attorney to review it and determine whether there's any issues or not. I always tell folks, there are too many agents that I hear play amateur surveyor. If you don't know for sure what the issue is, don't offer an opinion until, I would suggest getting something in writing from the attorney, and no reason to not get something in writing from the surveyor also. So they can explain to you, you can show your client, okay, this is what we're dealing with. The surveyor says that there's an encroachment here. The surveyor says that the house is within the setback here. That way you're relying on them, because they're the ones that are being paid for this, not you. So they're the ones who are being paid to render their opinion. So ultimately your client's going to want to hear from them, and they'll want to hear kind of the what do I do. So if you get to the what do I do point, call me, call whatever attorney's handling the closing. The attorney can work on the curative process. The attorney can say, okay, these are the steps that we're going to lay out. Now, ideally, we review the survey, and this is most surveys we do, there's no issue. So if there's no issue, we'll be like, hey, we'll send it to the title insurance company, have them approve it. They'll remove the survey exception on the title insurance policy, and then we'll move forward. So that's the ideal. That's usually what happens, but every once in a while we do see an issue where a survey does not have ideal situations. So we'll address that. Any questions on what to do when the survey is back? All right. So here are your most commonly seen issues in no specific order. So a lot of times we will find encroachments that have already been agreed upon. We'll find encroachments with a fence. We'll find outbuilding encroachments, which are basically your sheds, things like that. Your right-of-ways and utility easements, and I don't really consider this an issue, but they do pop up on surveys and people do ask us questions about them. And then your setback violations, which is, again, when a house is built outside of the approved distance from either the neighbor's property or from the road or from the rear of the property. So we'll go ahead and address what your standard survey looks like. So this is a survey that from a couple of years ago, just identifies basically where a couple of encroachments are. So you should be able to identify a couple of them just by looking at it. So if you can spot the encroachments, let me know. Feel free to unmute. So we got
Shed in the corner.
Yep. What's that, Cecilia?
The shed.
Yep. The shed down at the, I guess that would be the eastern part of the property.
Yep.
And there's one more.
Covered carport.
Yep. That's right, Melissa. The cover, yeah, the covered carport at the, I guess that'd be the western part of the property at the top has that overhang that encroaches by 1.88. That's also an encroachment because it is something that's a side building that does impact the neighbor's ability to build anything there. So that's also technically considered an encroachment also. So this is kind of, so you, but you can also see it'll identify exactly where all the, where the driveway is, where the fences are, everything like that. Also identifies sidewalks, distances, making sure it's no violations of setback. Now here, there were no setbacks. So there are other, if you've got a survey with a setback, you're generally going to see a dotted line that's some distance inside the parcel, which will identify where that setback is. And then this one also discusses your impervious area. And there are some places, there's some lots that do have impervious restrictions. So basically, if you're not aware of what your impervious restrictions are, that is where if there's some municipalities, if they're in wastewater, essentially within wastewater districts where they're having issues with wastewater or issues with erosion, soil, where you can only have up to a certain amount of your property be what's called impervious, which means covered in some way by concrete, dwelling, or anything in that, or any structure. So if it's not covered, then that's not considered impervious. But I mean, in this one, you got 8,886 square feet of impervious areas because you got your pool, you got your driveway, outbuildings, house porches. So that all adds up pretty quick. So if you are working with a client and you know that there's an impervious restriction there, it's always a good suggestion to consider discussing with them of what the steps are with impervious work. You generally have to work with the county to either try and get a variance, which they're very reluctant to do with impervious because it does have to do with environmental factors. So we've seen people have to either buy small lots within the same impervious zone, like small chunks of lots in order to comply. It's very weird. There are other attorneys that deal with this a little more than we do. So I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds on impervious areas, but just know if you run into an impervious area, just reach out to me. I can give you a little advice on kind of what your next steps should be. And then there are your identifications of those two encroachments. So you got the one at the top of the lot, one at the bottom of the lot. So excuse me, and those are east and west respectively. Because if you look at your the big fancy N, sorry about that, you look at the big fancy N down at the bottom with the point where it's actually pointing north that's north. So if you have you're trying to figure out what direction those restrictions are, you'd actually need to turn that a quarter of a page counterclockwise in order to make it north, to make true north be up, like you commonly see. Because and a lot of folks do get confused by that because they'll go out to their lot and they'll just start looking and they always think that north is going to be the top of the survey, but that's oftentimes not the case. So make sure you're able to help orient them as to what north is versus what directions are. All right, so let's say we review a survey, we see that there's a problem, we need to address it. There are four different options that your clients can do if they want to address it. Some of these options are available, some of these options often aren't available. So first option, you've got your do nothing. And a lot of sellers like option one because they don't have to do anything. A lot of buyers don't really like option one because they feel like they're buying a property where it's not perfect because you're moving into a property already you've got encroachment. Now, some of these encroachments are going to be super minor. Like there's going to be a fence that's 3 inches onto the buyer's property. Is that really going to affect their daily life? It's 3 inches that they don't have to mow, generally speaking. And so if that's what they decide they want, if they decide, hey, you know what, it's really minor, it's not going to affect my ownership, I'm happy to move forward. It's not really going to affect them in any sort of negative way. If their fence is on the other lot, the other fence is on their lot, I mean, the likelihood of someone requesting that you either move a fence over or bearing that expense, it exists, it is possible. We run into jerks all the time. But on the whole, taking the risk of doing nothing is a pretty calculated risk, depending on kind of what the cure would be for the issue. So if you're moving a big wooden fence for 3 inches to fix a 3-inch encroachment, I just don't necessarily know that juice is worth the squeeze. You could also, like I just talked about, request that the sellers or their neighbors move the encroaching property. We've seen this happen before, where folks have had a fence or a shed that's encroaching on the property. And especially this happens a lot with sheds, those plastic sheds you just pick up and move. We've seen people pick them up and move them. We've seen people essentially remove these sheds from foundations in order to move them onto the property. I mean, because you've got a kind of a finicky buyer who says, I'm not closing because this shed is a foot onto our property. So we've seen sellers have to negotiate that. A lot of onus does fall on sellers if you're dealing with an encroachment, because ultimately the buyers had nothing to do with the encroachment. The thinking is the sellers have had the past however many years they've owned the property in order to rectify it. Or when they bought it, they could have had the previous seller deal with it, but they decided not to get a survey. And should the buyer be punished by getting a survey? I don't necessarily think so, because they just want to make sure they're getting what they paid for. Because that's ultimately what we're doing here, is making sure, if you're representing a buyer, making sure that they're getting what they paid and as carefree as possible. Now, we can also do an encroachment agreement, and we do a lot of these. And basically what that is it's a buyer it's a seller and a neighbor, or an owner of property and the person that's encroaching on their property agreeing, saying, hey, we understand that you've got an encroachment here, and we are okay to leave that in place. We don't want to ruin everyone's day and make people move things. However, if you ever take the fence down, if you ever rebuild the shed, you have to do so on your property. Now, this benefits the person. This obviously would benefit the person who is encroaching upon the other person's property. But the other thing it has the effect of doing, and this benefits the person who is granting the encroachment, is it prevents that other party from being able to claim any sort of adverse possession or something like that, saying, I've used your land for this. My land has been on this side of the fence for 20 years. They get and you've known this and you haven't done a thing about it. Now that land is mine. They can sue and claim that land to be their own. Does it happen a lot? No, but this does prevent that from happening. And we typically, in our encroachment agreements, write something to the tune of seller or grantee party acknowledges that this is not their property. So that way it has the effect of helping out both parties on this. So there's both sides of the bargain. The other thing we have seen done, and I've done this as well, is you can actually deed part of your property, the property that is being encroached upon, to the neighbor. I have seen this, I've done this. This is gets a little more complicated because the party who is deeding the property off generally speaking, needs to own that property free and clear. If they don't own the property free and clear, then they have to negotiate with a lender in order to have a lot release, deed that over. It usually when you do that, it takes about 3-4 deeds to actually get it cleaned up, and that can get expensive and time consuming. So number 4 is not the option I typically go with, but on occasion it does make the most sense to do that. That's basically just in a situation where it's a completely immovable encroachment and all parties are willing to do it, and there's really no outstanding obligation on the lot which is being encroached upon. So it can be a good resolution, but it oftentimes is not the best resolution. Any questions about any of these? All right. So your encroachment versus your easement, I've kind of talked about this a little bit, but what is the difference? An easement fixes and permits an encroachment. And so there are a lot of different types of easements, or it'll basically allows that encroachment to be there or the usage to be there. So you've got your drainage easements, public use easements, right-of-way easements, blanket easements. People see an easement and they're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to give her an easement. Generally speaking, an easement's going to be a good thing because it's going to enable people to utilize your property to service the public. There are plenty of easements, especially these public use easements and these drainage easements. People don't know that it's there. And then the survey gets reviewed, but like, just so you know, you do have an easement there, and people kind of freak out and they're like, nope, it's fine. It's not going to affect how you live or anything like that. If you don't know about what you're seeing, please ask us, ask the surveyor. We'll both be able to identify. Any questions on that? All right, and how as an agent can you best help when you get a situation where you do understand that there's an outstanding encroachment? First, just being able to understand the options that are being offered, the 4 options I talked about before. Being able to give a very basic understanding, but if you're not comfortable with it, your client won't be comfortable with what you're telling them. So you got to make sure you understand what's being offered first. So let's say you get that email, yes, there's an encroachment. Here are your different options. If you're still not comfortable with it, feel free to have your clients call the attorney and let the attorney explain it to you. Because ultimately it's not necessarily, you're not expected, like I said before, you're not being paid to do the survey. You're not being paid to evaluate the survey. So it shouldn't necessarily be the expectation that you do either the drawing, evaluation, explanation, or anything like that. So feel free to let us do that. Now, obviously, you'll want to give your perspective as well as kind of dovetailing through as to how that affects the transaction and in the grand scheme of things. But feel free to you're not bothering us, because we'd much rather have your client understand what's going on rather than start kind of going haywire and freaking out. We don't want that. Make sure before you have let's say you want an encroachment agreement drafted, make sure you talk to the lender and the neighbors first to make sure that they're okay with that. There's some neighbors that we drafted an encroachment agreement, and it turns out that that I've been on this land for 50 years and I don't understand what's wrong with a handshake. I've heard, I can't tell you how many times, what's wrong with a handshake? Well, the lender, they can't evaluate a handshake. They can evaluate a road maintenance agreement, but they can't evaluate a handshake. So, but unfortunately, if we don't have the neighbors okay, and we've suddenly drafted this agreement and the neighbor says, I'm not signing this, then we've kind of spun our tires. And again, if you have any concerns, advise either the neighbor to contact an attorney, or because ultimately the seller can just say, you know what, if you're not going to okay this, then I'm just going to make you move your stuff. So, and they probably won't want that. So they can, ultimately the seller is going to be the one to get this resolved. So they'll just need to try and work with the neighbor to eventually get this resolved. And then just understand that there is a survey exception on your title insurance policy. It's a small amount of money. It's another title insurance benefit. You can also request an enhanced title insurance policy. Not a lot of people know about this. But if you have a question about enhanced policies, we can answer those also. Those will enable that no survey is required, but it'll give you some post-closing survey coverage. So they can act, it's about 20% more than your standard policy, and it gives a lot more stuff. If anybody has any questions on how an enhanced policy works, please come ask me. I can give you some information on that. So. And if you're listing a property that you know has an encroachment, go ahead and make friends with the neighbors, or at least hope your client, or figure out whether your client has a good relationship with the neighbors that you're encroaching on. And if they don't, have them repair that relationship, because you got to let your seller know that the responsibility to resolve the encroachment issue is on them. If the encroachment issue is bad enough, no one's going to want to buy the property. Now you want to be patient, because these can take some time. We're convincing the guy who has dealt with a handshake for 60 years and suddenly he's being asked to sign this document by some sketchy lawyer drew up. He's gonna want to be comfortable with what he's doing. So the further ahead you can get ahead of stuff like that, the better. And then explaining again the neighbor that the benefit to both the neighbor and the seller is it'll eliminate any sort of adverse possession lawsuit like I talked about before. Now, if you're representing a buyer who's buying her with an encroachment, you have to be willing to be flexible, but you also need to represent that there is a downside if the seller doesn't, either the seller doesn't cooperate or any neighbors don't cooperate, that you might have to be dealing with that encroachment. And if they're not willing to accept that, then it might not be the property for them. You'll always want to stay in contact with the attorney who's drafting the agreement. So don't ghost us, as you shouldn't anyway, but if you do that, it's going to be kind of hard for us to deal with that. And understand that you can always do an encroachment agreement after closing, as long as you have approval from the lender. And make sure you always keep the lender updated also. Most lenders are going to be okay with either delaying, and most are honestly going to be okay with an encroachment, as long as they know that the work that's being done is going to work to protect their asset. Any questions about any of that? All right. And if the buyer's property has an easement, it's probably benefiting the community in some way. It's not a death knell. The attorney will review the easement and notify you if there are any issues stemming from the easement. Like I said, you typically see your public use easements, drainage easements, most commonly, like light poles, drainage areas, fire hydrants, everything like that. They're all there. No one wants them on their property, but they all do benefit society. We have a fire hydrant and a light pole in our house. It's great. It's not the worst thing in the world. Now, if the buyer's property has a setback violation, generally speaking, it's probably nothing. So let's say you do a survey and it turns out the house is 3 feet into the setback. Well, the only time that setback violations are even going to be discovered is when your client is actually selling the property to somewhere else. The city is not going to make you remove your house. They're not going to make you tear your house down. They're basically going to say, hey, you have a setback violation. If you don't get it fixed within X number of time, we might fine you. You probably won't. Most setback violations are already grandfathered in anyway. So, but worst thing that can happen, the buyer's just gonna have to go get a variance. I rarely see the municipalities deny variances on minor setback violations if they're even required to be done. We've seen closings where the buyer does want the seller to go get a variance. That is going to delay closing for a couple months, but we've done closings where the buyer has required the seller to get that variance for them. You can do that, but again, just know it's going to be months, not weeks, in order to get that closed. And the attorney should be able to explain kind of what all the ramifications or repercussions of the setback violations are to your client in advance of closing, so they're not surprised when they get closed. All right. Does anybody have any questions over anything I've gone on, anything related to surveys, anything related to really anything? So I try to be an open book. I rarely. Melissa asked whether we see many adverse possession issues. We have people ask about it because they don't understand what it is and don't understand how to get there, but we will send them to a litigation attorney who will basically tell them it's going to be really hard to prove your case. And then that's usually where it goes. Does anybody have any other questions? Anything?
No, thank you, Nick, Appreciate
You're
this.
welcome, Cecilia. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming, Missy. Thank you as always, Melissa. And if anybody has any questions about anything, my door is always open. My phone number is always available. Feel free to call me, email at any time. I just want to help. So I really appreciate y'all. And yeah, I will talk to y'all next time.
Thank you.
Cecilia, I think I'll see you in a couple weeks.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. All right. Take care, y'all.
Thanks. Take care.
All right. Bye.
Bye.